Okay, here comes everyone right into our living rooms, or actually, I'm currently sitting on the ledge in Seoul, South Korea. Good morning, everyone. So great to see all of you. Everybody's looking great. I see some. Let's see. Do I see some smiles? I do see a smile. I see a very interested cat. Excellent. So happy to see all of that. So yes, welcome to today's festivities. I will be your host for today. I'm Darren Zook. I teach at UC Berkeley in the departments of Global Studies and Political Science. And some of you know me, I also teach with the OLLI program whenever I can. So we are here for a town hall today on understanding others, trying to craft a better path toward diversity and all the things related to it, you know, inclusivity, equity, all the things about that. Basically kind of the general theme of social justice. What could we do better, or what are we doing right now? We have, aside from me, we have two other panelists that you will meet. I'm going to basically introduce the first one, who is Sandra Bass. Sandra has to actually leave a bit early today. She has to leave by 11 o'clock at the latest, actually about 5 minutes before 11. So normally we have question and answer in the second half of the hour. So what I'll do is, as Sandra's talking, if you have any questions that you'd specifically like Sandra to address, after Sandra, you'll hear from Tamim Ansary, and you can put the questions in the chat function, and I'll leave a few minutes after Tamim speaks if Sandra wants to address any of the questions then. Otherwise, as all of us are speaking, just feel free to put your questions in the chat function, and then after the three of us end up giving a few brief remarks, we are happy to turn it over to you and turn this town hall into a large conversation between us and the 80 so or you of who are here. So that's the way we go for today. I'm going to let Sandra take it away. Sandra is, many of you may know Sandra, she's been in these town halls before, but she's the director of UC Berkeley's Public Service Center, one of the many hats that she wears, and she's going to go first. So Sandra, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I so love meeting with the OLLI folks, so glad to be here with you this morning. And I'm really sorry I have to leave early, and I'm really grateful that Darren and the OLLI crew were open to me participating even for this little bit. So what I wanted to start with today, I'm a political scientist by training, so it's kind of how my brain thinks. And so I wanted to start a bit by setting context and talking about our current political moment. So I think it's fair to say that academics in general are pretty measured, right? Pretty thoughtful, deliberate, and careful, not alarmist, not making conjecture. And so it's been interesting to see in the last few years just how much alarmist messaging I get from my fellow political scientists, right? Like, so, you know, one of the ones that's sticking out for me now is a letter that was signed by 150 political scientists, and the title was "Midnight is Approaching," about where we are in the context of our democracy. And of course, I agree with them. I would also say that for historically marginalized groups, midnight has always been approaching, if not where you live. And so it's interesting to see how this is being framed now. And I think they're right to be raising the alarm. It's a really difficult moment. And I also think that historically marginalized groups have been critical in pushing the boundaries of democracy and growing inclusivity and belonging. But I wanted to start here because when I think about my day-to-day conversations about diversity and social justice and democracy, it's almost as if people talk about them as if they don't intersect, as if they are parallel tracks and they're distinct and separate, and maybe at some point they connect, like around voting perhaps, but not really thinking more broadly about how all those concepts are connected. And so, you know, rightly so, much of our conversation about diversity and social justice focuses on ensuring basic human rights of historically marginalized and oppressed groups, and making sure that members of marginalized groups have voice in public decision making and have equitable access to the things that we need to thrive and you know, have basic well-being in this society. But what I wanted to lift up today is an aspect of the work around diversity and social justice that often isn't talked about. And that is that all of these concepts, whether it's democracy or diversity or social justice, are all interdependent social and communal aims. So when we're fighting for a fair and equal democratic voice in public decision making, that is only relevant to the extent that you're thinking about, well, what is the polity that you are trying to have fair and equal access to? Diversity is very similar. Diversity assumes that there's a shared community. And what is that community we're trying to diversify? And what are the community norms that we're trying to shift? And when we think about justice, whether that's distributive in terms of who gets what in a society, or it's about fair and equal treatment, or it's about restoring relationship and wholeness when there are breaches, as restorative justice suggests, all of that is only relevant and contingent upon a given communal or social context. And so what I often find missing in these conversations is this recognition that we need to pursue all these ends, diversity, democracy, justice, in a more holistic, integrated, and collective way. So recently, I had the honor of being in public conversation with Marshall Gans. Some of you may know him. Marshall spent his childhood, much of his childhood in Bakersfield, California. He's a legendary community organizer. And he went to Harvard for like 2 or 3 years, dropped out in the 60s to join the Mississippi Freedom Summer movement, where he was roommates with Mario Savio, I recently learned. And then he went to go work with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in organizing farm workers for about 14 years. And then many years later, went back to Harvard, got his degree, and now he teaches there. And the topic of our conversation was democracy in America, busy being born or busy dying. And I want to share something that Marshall said that was really, was important to me. The political is about engaging people with one another in finding collective solutions to change, conflict, and opportunity in non-violent ways. It is not a marketplace in which each individual pursues their own individual interests, which through some form of magic turns into what's in the common good. It's not simply the aggregation of individual voices. And I want us to consider whether diversity, equity, and justice has similar qualities. Diversity and social justice are not just the simple aggregation and pursuit of individual or even group interests, but something perhaps more complicated, but critical. It's something that has really never existed in the history of our country, but which is absolutely necessary for our continued survival as a national community and as a democracy. And that reimagining and realizing a whole new American story and identity that is grounded in the unwavering commitment to ensuring that all people belong is the direction that we need to be moving towards. And I prefer the term belonging to terms like inclusiveness because it connotates, I hope I got that word right, something much more fundamental. And that is belonging is a framework for understanding how groups are positioned within a society. So how they are perceived, how they are regarded, how that is reflected in how power is held, who exercises it, who determines the distribution of resources, who can craft our political and geographic landscape. Belonging is a much more broader conception of how we are co-creating that together than inclusiveness would suggest that people are being included into an existing structure. And it also, belonging also embraces differences and learns from them. It's not afraid of difference. And it recognizes that how we define who we are is also always an evolution, right? Because as new identities, groups, people become part of our polity, belonging recognizes that we need to expand our definition of who we are so that they are part of that process in a very deep and meaningful way. So to me, when we think about diversity and social justice, absolutely all the work we're doing to ensure the basic human rights and fundamental justice for groups that have been historically marginalized, absolutely. But we also need to be thinking about how we can move towards creating an American narrative and a story that expands our conception of who we are. And that will actually create a sense of, it sort of creates a different context in which we're working versus just only the sort of we're fighting for our rights model, right? Which is critical, but not sufficient, I guess I would say. So that's a tall order. So let me talk a little bit about what I think might be helpful as we move in that direction. I think we need to think about deeper connections between civic education and diversity education. So we've been seeing both of these things moving at the K through 12 level. All this controversy around critical race theory, which we all know is not what's being taught, but it's just this frame that certain folks are using to kind of discredit that work. But it sort of lifts up that we need to do this understanding of what is our history and how has that history been experienced by people of different identities. And there's also been a movement, particularly after the Jan 6 attack on the Capitol, to increase civic education at the K through 12 level. So I haven't seen much of this, but I would really love to see deeper connectivity between both of those two things. How do we sort of talk about our history, educating people about the historical and contemporary experiences of historically marginalized people, to see how we've all been harmed by exclusionary practices and how we've also all been benefited by the strengthening of democratic practice. So how do we sort of crosswalk those two things? And what's interesting is when you have education at the K through 12 level, I've seen this in other areas that I've worked on. You think it's just, okay, it's great that we're educating youth. That's in and of itself a really valuable end. But those students actually bring that back to their parents and their family members oftentimes. And so it actually can have a ripple effect. And so I'd love to see more of that. Another technique that I'm seeing that really holds a lot of promise is, it's called deep canvassing. And it's really interesting that it's a model for mobilizing people, typically in elections. But what's fascinating about deep canvassing is really what they found from the research is that if you talk to people and you are non-judgmental and you actually listen to them and you hear their stories and they hear your stories and you share, what are some of the challenges that historically marginalized people, like in particular, they've looked at some of the challenges for trans men and women and immigrants. But if you actually have conversation, that people actually can find a way of being able to humanize historically marginalized people. So people who held really difficult, problematic views actually shift, and you develop some kind of relationship. And it's just fascinating to me that that's really what that's about. It's about relationship building. And so that's being rolled out in lots of areas all over the country. And I think that holds a lot of promise. One more thing I'll share, and then because I know I'm almost at time, and I think this is more controversial, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this. But we have to do something, and I don't know what that something is, about the blatant lying and disinformation that is being shared in this country. And we know that to be true, right? Like the big lie about the election, we all know that's not true. All the data shows that. And again, we use this metaphor of the marketplace when we talk about free speech. And I don't know what the answer is. But it seems to me that whatever that particular understanding of the marketplace was when we were talking, building the free First Amendment centuries ago, is not where we are today. And it's interesting because young people see it, and that's one of the reasons why they push up against it. It's both insightful and a little disturbing that I think a lot of young people don't see the value of free speech. Or even sometimes question the value of democracy. And it's because so often they see that these terms are used to justify behavior that is really outside of the bounds of what we think of free speech and what it should be, or outside of the bounds of what we think democracy should be. And so I don't know what the answer is here, but I think we really need to have a serious conversation about it, because if we allow this to continue, it's going to be really difficult to have the kind of conversations that can help us think about how we can come together as a national community. So with that, I'll leave it there.
Okay, then. Thank you so much, Sandra, for your insights. And I think the last point has generated quite a few replies and comments. And what we're going to do is I'm going to move next to Tamim Ansari. And if we have time after that, if Sandra's still around, she can respond to some of the questions potentially. So in the meantime, let's shift gears and go to Tamim Ansari, who is our next presenter. Tamim is a African-American author and is referred to by many people as our resident genius. And so we're going to let him share his genius insights with everyone today. And so Tamim, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Darren. Well, two things that that Sandra said, the two words that really jumped out at me. One was belonging, and the other was holistic. And the word that I wanted to come in here with, in terms of understanding others, is context. And my idea of what context is so closely related to holistic. There is, each of us lives in some universe that only we know all of the things that are in that universe. So with that little bit of an introduction, I just want to wander into some anecdotal kind of meanderings about the two times that I visited Afghanistan over the last 20 years, and then some thoughts about that, and related to the mystification that so many people have about the ending of that involvement of the U.S. in that country, and the question that has arisen as to how did we get it so wrong? How did we not know that this is what was happening, or that this was going to happen? And so I grew up in Afghanistan. I left there when I was 16. It was 1964, and when it was I came here, I went to school, and at a certain point, I did sort of think about going back, but some politically catastrophic things that happened there, or politically, menacing things that happened there. My father said, hold off for a year or two until we see where this is going. But actually, from then on, each new political event was a degradation of the situation rather than improvement. And so, as it turned out, then came the war. Oops, where am I? You all disappeared from my screen for a moment there. Anyway, so then came the war, then came the Civil War, the Russian invasion. Finally, the Taliban took over. And so the first time I could go back was 30 some years after I left. And that was in the wake of 9/11. It was 2002 when I first went back to Afghanistan. And the thing is, the city in which I was born and spent probably half my life in Afghanistan was the city of Kabul. And every neighborhood that I knew in Kabul was so utterly devastated and demolished that it was unimaginable to me. I could drive for 2 hours through those neighborhoods and not see a single building that was standing, or a single structure that had a roof. And yet, a mysterious thing happened there. And the mysterious thing was that talking to people on the streets, wherever I went, I felt known. I felt like this is a place where people know me. And when I went, to look up my remaining relatives, all of the close relatives I knew, virtually all of them had gone into exile. They were either refugees or they had made it to the United States. So the people that I knew there, that I was connected to, were not people I knew personally. But as soon as I encountered them, it was like, how's Rebecca? How's Riaz, your brother? Where's your mother now? Oh, she passed away. So sorry. They knew everything about me. They knew who my father was, my uncles, where I came from. I just felt completely known. And when I arrived in Afghanistan in 2002, right in the wake of the war, I didn't know how I was going to find anybody that I was connected to, or where I was going to stay. But I found, there was a taxi cab that came, and I said, all I know is I have a cousin who lived near Silo, the big bread factory. Do you think we could find that place? He said, yeah, sure, why not? And we drove to that area, and we just got out on the streets, and I started talking to people, and they said, oh, who are you? Do you know so, blah, blah, blah. And within no time at all, they were, oh, you're talking about, Aminuddin Ansari. Okay, so that house is over there. And they took me there. And when I got there, it's like, oh yeah, this is the place. I recognized it from 37 years ago or whatever. And it was a curious thing, because then when I came back to the United States, and I went to my you know, the writers workshop that I ran, and then me and my buddies, all the fellow writers, we went to a bar, and all of a sudden, among them, I felt completely known, and in a different way, because these people knew what movies I liked, where I had gone to college, where I had this, where I had that. It was all about me, but they knew me. And those people in Afghanistan, they all knew where I fit in to some vast clan structure. And I have to say that when I went back to Afghanistan in 2002, it was, I've often described it as feeling like I was in Woodstock, although I wasn't actually ever in at Woodstock. But you know, that thing you hear about, just the sense of elation and euphoria. That was Afghanistan in 2002. And I went back 10 years later, after 10 years of the American involvement, and everything had been rebuilt. The booming commercialism of that city, the streets were all paved, there was millions of cars, the shops were just bristling with goods. And I felt like, man, 10 years of American dollars has done something that 20 years of Soviet bombing wasn't able to do. It's killed whatever was here. It wasn't just that I didn't feel a sense of belonging. Nobody felt a sense of belonging there. We had succeeded in building a world in which we had replaced with material prosperity. What we had replaced with that was home, a sense of home. And when I hear what Sandra had to say, I felt like our project here is to, and I hear it so much in people I talk about, there's this nostalgia for home that everybody seems not to have. And we're mystified as to how to create that sense of home. And I'm with you, Sandra, on inclusion as a part of that, but it's not enough, because there has to be a sense of belonging amongst all these people that don't understand each other. And the political program is to include everybody, but include everybody in what? We have to build something. So I feel that when the United States went to Afghanistan, our sense of that was that this country is poor, and what we can do to help this country is give them stuff. And what we didn't see was the home, the sense of home that Afghans actually did have, and that they'd managed to preserve that in the face of all the destruction of bombs and so on, such that in that 2002 visit, me and my connections, my family connections, we drove out to someplace 20 miles from the city, and we just got out of the car and sat down by this river. Within 20 minutes, there was like 10 people just wandered in from, I don't know where, they lived around there. And they brought baskets of freshly plucked mulberries, and we just sat there for like 3 hours, just chatting about what? I don't know. That would not happen anywhere where I am now. I will follow up all that by saying that I cherish what I have here that isn't that kind of a life. What I have here is individualism. And what we have in America that we want to protect is the rights and the opportunities for all individuals to achieve whatever it is their individual selves want. That's a great thing, and I cherish that. But there's also something else that is in the world that we ought to be cherishing and seeking. And I think that's where we are not really on top of things. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and then we'll see what you guys have in the conversation section. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Tamim. We've got other questions rolling in about what you were talking about. As I said at the start of today's program, Sandra, if you're still with us, if there's anything you'd like to follow up on your comments with after you've seen some of the questions roll through in the chat, anything you'd like to directly address? I see you've been answering some of the chats personally. So, but anything you'd like to follow up with, Sandra?
No, I was just looking at the chat, and I really want to lift up this point that Larry highlighted about Tamin's talk, which is that Americans do not have a sense of home. That is so true. I'll just say for myself, it's very interesting. This came up in a conversation I had recently with some colleagues who do similar work to mine, which is that rightly so, we really focus a lot on the difficulties we've had as a country on the progressive side, right? Like we're very rightly critical of our history, where we are, the kinds of things that we do, but we don't give anybody like an on-ramp to another way of thinking about being an American and this being our home. For myself, I'll tell you, like I was that person, right? Like I barely thought of myself as an American until I started to travel outside of America. And then I realized, oh my God, I am so American. And so there's something here about what can we do so that we have a shared investment in, the US as a home. And can I also highlight, like sometimes when I see these billionaires flying off into space, I also think like, this is clearly like, all the things that you could be doing with your billions of dollars and you're doing joyrides in space. Now, granted, there'll be some great scientific findings that come from this that can benefit us and what have you. But there's just something that we don't, there's a lack of an investment in the shared destiny of this country. And particularly from certain segments of the society. So I don't know, I just leave it at that.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, Sandra. I know you have to hop off here shortly, so I'm glad you had a chance to at least add a bit in and respond to some of these questions. As I go into my presentation, Sandra's going to leave us. So I do want to say, again, thanks so much for being here today. Look forward to seeing you again in a future town hall. All right, so I'm the last speaker. I'll be as quick as I can. And in many ways, the three speakers, we didn't necessarily sit down and map all this out, but it's working really nicely because my questions were, my comments are basically designed to address what I'll call diversity 2.0. That is, I'm thinking in terms of where does this need to go? And I'm just going to turn this into kind of a thought exercise, but it's I'll focus on the university, but this is easy to kind of rearrange and implement anywhere else. So one of the things I see at the university level, and quite frankly, in the United States, is that what we've done to date with our initiatives about diversity is we have basically brought together pieces of the puzzle, or we've brought together the pieces of an engine, and we have the pieces. They're all different. We can see the diversity of the pieces, but we haven't built the engine. That is, we don't have the ignition or the spark. It doesn't have any animus yet. We have different heritages in the same room, but what we don't have is we don't have the understanding. So if you look at understanding as the thing that makes diversity work, as the kind of ignition spark of diversity, the question is, how can we get there? Because to me, it seems, what Tamim's getting at with this idea of a sense of home, and what Sandra's also getting at with this idea of the sense of rootedness, is that thing. Once we all feel like we can understand each other, we have that feeling in America that Tamim had when he was back in Afghanistan, saying, in essence, I had the sense of rootedness, that people knew me. So here's just one idea, very quick, and then we'll turn to questions. So for instance, let's suppose at the university, we implement a program, any university, we stay with UC Berkeley, and in order to graduate, you have to earn what I'll call 10 diversity points. And what would that look like? So suppose you get 2 points for taking a class on civic education or civil democracy, something like that. More importantly, one of the things I see at universities across the United States is many universities, including UC Berkeley, we have a foreign language requirement in many majors. I wish it was a requirement in all majors. And the point of a foreign language requirement is to get you to understand difference, to understand that different languages and different cultures think differently. And yes, it's a struggle. You have to, you're normally an eloquent person, and then suddenly a sentence like, "Where is the cat?" takes you 5 minutes to figure out what the words are. And that's kind of the struggle of trying to understand others. So what happens at the universities is students frequently, to avoid that, will take languages that are languages they either already know or they're at least familiar with. So for instance, heritage languages. And I'm not saying learning a heritage language is wrong, but let's say to get 2 diversity points on your way to graduation, you intentionally have to take a language that you know nothing about. Encourage people to say, I'm gonna make that leap of faith, and I'm gonna force myself to understand how someone else sees the world. Because the idea again is to understand otherness. This is a town hall called Understanding Others, and putting ourselves in an uncomfortable situation, or more importantly, an unfamiliar situation, and then turning what is unfamiliar into something familiar, that strikes me as a good way to build a sense of belonging and a sense of home. So being able to see the world as others see it. There are other things I've noticed, for instance, we've talked a lot about democracy. Sandra mentioned, January 6th and these things. It's interesting that, I've also done, and many of you in the OLLI program have joined me for classes and other discussions that relate to this, but it's interesting how what we think is a dialogue about understanding someone else becomes a dialogue about trying to get that person to convert them to the way we see things. And that's one of the problems with partisanship in this country, is that you put a liberal and a conservative together, and it's not about a liberal trying to understand how a conservative sees the world. It's a liberal trying to tell the conservative that their way is wrong, or vice versa. The conservative saying, hey, liberal, let's have a conversation so I can show you that you're wrong, which is also probably not the best way to cultivate a sense of civic and civil belonging in the United States. I'm so happy that Tamim, for instance, addressed the idea of kind of going to Afghanistan, and also, going to a place that was familiar and then became unfamiliar, because, that, it seems to me, is the ongoing work of what diversity should be doing for us. And we're not there yet. We're still just assembling the pieces. But if I were to map where I would want diversity to go, it would be to, the most important thing here, as I said, the ignition, the spark of getting us all together in a diverse, actually, what I said to my class the other day was, America is diverse, but we don't yet have diversity. And so I think understanding that spark of life where we can talk across our differences and fully understand each other, that strikes me as a good direction to go to. And again, feel free to disagree with me. Feel free to call me yet another Berkeley idealist, and I might say guilty as charged, but I thought I'd at least throw an idea out there to see what you might think of that. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap up my comments, because part of the town hall is that we hear from you. We have a discussion. You don't just sit back and listen to some talking heads. We hear from you, and we see what we can do to clarify things or keep the conversation going. So I am going to do that now, and Tamim and I will be the ones who are fielding the questions. So again, feel free to put anything you like, comments, insights, questions, into the chat area, and I'll be scrolling through and reading them and putting them out either for Tamim or myself. So there we have it. I know there was a question here that was directly for Tamim. There's a couple in here. Let me see if I can find them. So I'm going to field this directly towards Tamim. It's from Amy. It says, Tamim, on returning to your homeland, did you feel like your contextual framework was stuck in a time warp? How difficult was it to get, quote, caught up?
I felt like my framework was in a time warp, both when I went there and when I came back, because, and in fact, I feel like, part of our situation and what's problematic about it is that our framework is constantly in the process of changing. So we're all in this state of constantly leaving a home that we're imagining we had. I've spent all the time since I came back from Afghanistan in 2002 working out what Afghanistan meant to me in the course of my whole life, and what it means to me now when I look at video of Afghanistan with the Taliban in charge now, and what I see in that video, among other things, is a whole world full of people who, whatever else is happening to them, it looks to me like they're saying, finally, we're on our own and we can figure out what we want to do. And, it's so different from what I see when I look at the Afghanistan that's portrayed on BBC or CNN or anybody else that's reporting on it. Just when I see video of people walking around in Kabul or other cities and just talking to people on the street. So.
All right, thanks for that, Tamim. It's great to have a different perspective than what gets shown on an endless kind of cycle on either social media or news. So the next question that it's nice, it's short and sweet, but it's a great question, which is, what is a more perfect union? And I'm going to throw in a thought here, and I'll let Tamim add something if he wants to as well. So, when our kind of racial reckoning really opened up with the protests about George Floyd, you heard a number of people say, the social contract has been rent asunder. The social contract of America has been ripped apart. And I kind of saw it a different way, which is that the social contract that the United States had, a contract is only valid if all partners who subscribe to the contract helped write the contract and sign it. And in many ways, one of the things the United States has never done is we never revised that contract. The contract was kind of written before, African Americans were not invited to write the contract. They were kind of given this. It's like, okay, after emancipation, this is what you have to do. Immigrants who came, waves of immigrants coming after that, it was kind of like, here's the pre-written contract. You didn't get to write it or sign it, but you have to abide by it. And I think, when people talk about a racial reckoning, it's not a phrase I like all that much, but a more perfect union, I would think, would be one where we do rewrite a social contract. That, as Tamim said in Afghanistan, that, now we have the moment where we can decide what we want to do. This might be exactly that moment to sit down and say, as we try to, you can't write the contract without trying to understand others, which is what we're here to discuss. And so that, to me, is at least one step towards what I would see at this point in time as a more perfect union. Tamim, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, just two things. One is that because the civilization that I feel like I'm living in now, the ultimate premise of that civilization is that the unit of humanity is the individual person. And our contract starts from there and says the individual person, every single one has the same rights as every other single one. That is the premise of our contract, and the problem is we've never actually put that into practice. So we have to do that. That reckoning cannot be put off. The other thing is that every single person having the same rights is one issue, and then there's the issue of social bonds and interconnectedness. That gets this issue of home. And that's a separate issue. We can't put either one off. We have to do both. So yeah. that's my contribution.
Very good point. Point well taken. I'm going to move now to it's less of a question, although it's kind of a part two of a question. This is from Amy. Which the first part of the question is, isn't it the responsibility of the government to set boundaries regarding what is the common good? But then there's a follow-up comment that I think is quite interesting. It says, inclusion cannot be tokenism. True participation takes an openness that some people are not willing to entertain. And I think it's a great insight. I like the question and the insight. I mean, it's one of the things I was getting at with my, quote, diversity point system was precisely to get around that because I wrote an article last month about, why Proposition 16 failed in California. And I do hear a lot, at least at UC Berkeley, from students and others about how our current approach to diversity, the byproduct is this kind of rampant expansion of tokenism. And, the way, the challenge is, how do you get towards, a goal of the common good as inclusivity without having that tokenism? I'll give you one comment here, and then I'm happy, again, we'll hear what Tamim has to say. So for instance, with, the idea that we now have a potential of a Supreme Court opening, I know there's fights back and forth about, Biden's promise to nominate a Black woman, but I'm not saying that's wrong, but the thing is a category was chosen before a person. And that's kind of one of the ways this happens to creep in, because we think of people in terms of categories and not in terms as an individual who may have a heritage different from ours. And I think that's one of the problems we have, is we do tend to think in those kinds of categories, as opposed to seeing people for the individuals that they are with their own complex background. I don't know if Tamim, you have any thoughts on that, if you'd like to add into that discussion?
Just one, and that is that the situation in which it's impossible to avoid experiencing the wholeness of another person is when you are actually with that other person biologically in a space. And the extent to which our interactions with other people are in the abstract zone that is just text messaging, or even just, the written word to some extent, that makes it more possible to veer towards categories rather than persons. And so what I would say is that a thing we lack is a framework of opportunities for people who disagree with each other and feel violently uninclusive towards others could actually sit in the same room and not, and just talk. We don't have that. We don't have that opportunity.
Yes, I agree with you
and
completely.
Curiously enough, in American history, one of the places where the integration of blacks and whites happened more than in many other places was in the army, so because they were physically in the same space, they couldn't avoid being. The government said you have to be there.
Yes, very good point. I'm gonna turn this question to you first, Tamim, because I think it ties into many of your comments that you made when you were discussing, what it meant to return to Afghanistan. So we have a question here from Kathy saying, for learning a language to promote understanding, doesn't the class need to be beyond just vocabulary and grammar, but more on your OLLI model of including culture, food, and history? And there's two things I want to point out here. One of which is, I don't think at UC Berkeley we teach any of the languages of Afghanistan. I know we teach Farsi, which is not quite the same thing. So I don't know if we do that, but I'm curious. You went to Afghanistan and you at least grew up there and had some familiarity. What do you think? Can you give an example of what it would take for, say, someone who's a UC Berkeley student or a student anywhere, or quite frankly, an OLLI student, to, quote, try to understand what it means to be Afghan American, or to understand what it would mean to be in Afghanistan?
Well, this probably isn't an answer to that question, but two things sprang to mind as you were talking. And one is, language is not just vocabulary and grammar. And I'm reminded of something that a French teacher once said to me when I gave a lecture about translation. And she said, when a kid asked me, how do you say that in French? I say, you don't. and then I've been teaching my one of my daughters Farsi, which is the language of Afghanistan. We have an accent of Farsi called Dari, but it's really the same language. But in teaching that language to her, I'm so astounded to discover for myself the tracks that a language takes to arrive at meaning, and how things like spy or newspaper or money or whatever, we construct those words and they have connections to other words in English. And then in Farsi, when I'm teaching my daughter, I see perfectly sensible ways in which words are constructed that have whole other string of associations with other words. And it has to do with the culture there. So there's that. And then I'm all for learning seeing dances, learning the Atan, experiencing the foods of other cultures, learning their music and stuff. There is an element of tokenism that can enter into that too, because this gets back to context. It's what you have to be able to do and try to get more towards doing is to not cherry pick particular aspects of another culture and then absorb them into your own context and just put them there. What you want to be able to see is how that fits into a whole constellation of other concepts and ideas that's somebody else, there's an actual other constellation over there. That's what we have to try to get to.
Yes, agree completely. As many of the OLLI folks know, I'm a language nerd, and part of it is just, I just love trying to understand how other people think through their languages. One other comment on that, which I always find this, I don't know why I find this startling. I'm always startled that UC Berkeley, we teach so many languages. We teach, medieval Tibetan, right? But you know what we don't teach? We don't teach Native American languages. Like you can't take Navajo or Cherokee. Shouldn't that be kind of obvious that we need to do that? Because not only it'd be such a great way to just understand. Again, as Tamim pointed out, learning a language is not everything, but it is such an open window into what it means to be something else. So I just find that amazing that we teach so many things, but we forget about I'd love to take a class in Navajo or Creek or something like that. Okay, so next question up, we have actually 2 or 3 questions that kind of are addressing this, which is basically, how do we get around this idea that diversity and culture and ways of thinking is a competitive zero-sum game? That is, if African-American culture is becoming more and more understood, there's this feeling of anxiety, say, by white Americans that they're losing ground, that basically there's only a limited amount of space, and so the only way, and you can see this even in the affirmative action case that's going through Harvard, where Harvard was like, well, we have to get rid of, or reduce the number of students from this group so we can have more students of this group, and it creates this real sense of competitiveness. That diversity is a win-lose proposition. So how can we make diversity into a win-win proposition where we all feel included, as opposed to feeling like to include one person, we have to exclude another? There's quite a few questions about this. Tamim, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Afghanistan, I know, is an incredibly diverse country, as is the United States. So if you can address it from any point of view you'd like.
Well, I think the larger, issue that we're facing on this planet as a human species is that all of these cultures are a whole context. And in the earliest times, we were physically separated from other cultures. We overlapped with a few neighboring ones. But now, because of where we've come with technology and globalization, all of us are in the same room with all other cultures. And in the course of history, it has been the case that different cultures have not necessarily just dissolved into each other. People hold on to a culture, but they become participants also in some larger culture, some larger context that includes both of those earlier contexts as parts of a whole. And that's what we're trying to do now and trying to build. And we haven't gotten there yet. But the fact that we're arguing and it's contentious and it's problematic, my positive side says that's just on the way to building the world culture that we need. So we're not there yet, but let's be patient. Let's just keep doing it.
Yes, I like the idea. I find it interesting that in terms of losing culture versus gaining culture, I mean, from my point of view, you can only gain more culture. And we can see this on the micro level, in the sense that, I have a good friend who's he's of Latino heritage, and he married a woman of Indian heritage. And when they got married, there was this wedding in which we had Indian food with a mariachi band, and nobody felt like they were, which side do I go to? If I'm Indian, I listen to the mariachi band. Am I losing my Indianness? Oh my God, I just had a piece of naan. I'm less Latino now. I mean, when you look at it at the interpersonal level, it's like, it's just absurd to think that way. But then we get collective, and suddenly it's like, oh no, if I'm listening to this kind of music, am I losing my culture? It's like, no, it's like, we're human sponges. We can gain more culture, and I can see no harm coming from that. Okay, yes, and someone's saying acculturation, not assimilation. Or as I sometimes tell my student about assimilation, I say we should all just assimilate to each other. That seems to be a perfectly fine way of going about it. Let's see. Question here coming in. We have a highly segregated society in the US in terms of places where people live and go to school and work. Don't we first have to integrate our physical living, working in educational spaces, so we have more interactions between ethnically different people? And that, by the way, Daniel, is when I say we're a diverse society, but we don't have diversity. That's one of the things I was getting at. That I agree with you. We kind of have to take that first step away from what is comforting to many of us, which is to live among people of a similar mindset. Those of you that took my extreme politics class may remember I shared a quote that I found on the app Nextdoor, in which somebody said, "Isn't it great to live?" They're talking about Berkeley. It said, "Isn't it great to live in a community of like-minded people?" And in that class, I kind of said, actually, it's not. Actually, what we want to do is we want to live in a community of different-minded people. Daniel, I think you're spot on with that. The question is, how do we make that happen? And so my short proposal of the point system was one way to induce people to do that. So Tamim, I don't know if you have any other insights or things to add to that of how we might make it happen, or whether we should make it happen, but go right ahead.
I'll only say that I stopped watching football for a few years because I disapproved of it politically. But this year I decided, you know something? There are people I'm going to meet in my life that there's a lot of things we won't have to talk about. We can't talk about. But I actually like football. I can talk about football. I'm not giving up football. I want to be able to talk to people with whom that might be the only thing we can really engage on. So.
Yeah, and for some people that is. I was always amazed when I was going to the YMCA, and I hope before the year is over I can go back in. I was always amazed at how much people they could talk for hours. It was like one of the few things that people could. Politics, that'll last 3 minutes. Football, I'd go work out, come back an hour later, they're still sitting there, in the sauna just talking football. It's like, okay, if that's the language everybody can speak, I'm not a football fan, but you know what? I can understand how other people are. Speaking of sports, I'm going to throw in, I'm going to wear my Berkeley utopian hat for a minute. So I'm going to live in the world, here's my plan for the Olympics. I gave you my point system. I think it would be really cool if we did the Olympics differently. If every country had to adopt another country, in the sense that, there was just a random draw, and it's like you had the United States, and the United States was paired with, let's say, Afghanistan, and you had to follow that team too. You had to root for that team, and you had to make that team your own. Think of how different the Olympics would be, because it becomes kind of this nationalist competition, kind of like USA. Medal counts. But if you had another team you were looking out for, it'd be like, oh yeah, then everybody's looking up, where's this person from, all that kind of stuff. I think that would just change the whole dynamic of the Olympics. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Tamim, but it probably wouldn't work with football. If every football fan had to choose 2 teams instead of 1. But anyway, all right. We've had quite a few questions roll in about some kind of, they're calling it conservation corps, some kind of required service, whether it's military or civic service or helping to build the infrastructure, or just in some way that I'm assuming young Americans at some point before they either go to undergraduate or right after they, finish their undergraduate education, engage in some type of 1 year or 2 year service to the country, hoping that would in some ways, I guess, cultivate a civic-minded sense, and also, since presumably would put us in a different part of the country, help us understand others. I personally am a little uncomfortable with the idea of required service, but I see where it's coming from. So I'm going to turn this one to Tamim first and see if he has any thoughts on whether we should institute some kind of civic conservation or civic cultivation corps. Do you like this idea or no?
I kind of do, actually. When I was a young feller, there was something that united a lot of young people. And that was the draft. Of course, it united us in opposition to it. So there was that. There was also a disuniter. But I kind of think, something like a domestic
there's that too.
Corps, that would be pretty cool.
Okay, I like it. By the way, you're still a young feller. We're all young fellers and fellas and whatever you would. We're all young at heart. And I'm glad you said that, actually, because I know you were just using it as a way to introduce a thought. But I've always been delighted. I know a number of the OLLI folks have joined in this intergenerational dialogue I've been hosting for the last, wow, 3 years at this point. And I think that's, when we talk about diversity, we often forget about age. We often forget about the need to understand that age does bring, hopefully, a certain kind of wisdom and life experience, which is invaluable to share with others who are just charting their path. And so if we did have one of these civic conservation corps or anything like that, I would like to see that included as well. So understanding that people who were simply born in different years have some life experience that is valuable for all of us to learn from. All right, let's see, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'll go with let's see, one more here. Let's see, actually, so here's a question. This is again from Amy. It says, we have to be carefully taught. Shouldn't first steps be to teach multicultural history to children? Waiting until college is too late. Agreed upon that. But with all the hullabaloo, by the way, hullabaloo, one of my favorite words, comes to us from India, comes from the language of Telugu. I just love saying it, hullabaloo. Over critical race theory is partly driven by that fear of the win-lose idea behind multiculturalism. But I agree on the idea of being carefully taught, because education, I think, is one of the most powerful engines of growth and tools of change. So I would like to see a complete revamping of K through 12 education in this country in a way that can do civic education without it sounding like patriotic indoctrination, and that could teach multiculturalism in ways that avoid the tokenism or the kind of propaganda stories that that everything that happened was only good. Sometimes we have to hear that we've all made mistakes for things to work better. I don't know, Tamim, if you have any thoughts on critical race theory or education as an agent of change when it comes to understanding others, but if you do, go right ahead.
Well, the one thing that I do want to note is that education is a word that's often used as if it were a neutral good. It's often used as education and medicine. It's like nobody has any different ideas about medicine. That's a good thing. Education, however, it's everybody wants to learn, but nobody wants to be educated, because educated is something that's done to you, and learning is something you do. So there's always something to be careful about when you say, oh, education is the answer, because somebody is educating somebody. And so there is always a question about what is the information or the idea set that's being transferred here.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, we could go on and on about education. My hope is that one day our education budget in this country will match the military budget. Wonder what the chances of that would be. Great. And let's not forget that education comes in a variety of formats. There's peer-to-peer education. There's, of course, K through 12 higher learning, but learning and a college degree don't go hand in hand. You can I sometimes get annoyed when people ask, by level of degree. I work with a lot of people with PhDs, and they're not always the brightest people. And I know many people who don't have college degrees who are just brilliant. I trust them with my life. Somebody said, I joined the Peace Corps in 2001 to change my life. I'm glad you said that, because I tell so many of my students, Peace Corps is a life changer. So I'm glad to see that actually I'm not steering them wrong. All right, so here's the deal, folks. We have 2 minutes left, and that means it's time for us to kind of ease our way out of the town hall. So I do want to thank Sandra. She's not here right now, but I'll send her an email of thanks later. Tamim, thank you so much also for sharing your insights with everybody and answering the questions. And I think, I just loved hearing your stories and your talk and your comments. For the rest of you, we'll have other town halls in the future. We're always happy to keep the dialogue going. Tamim, before we sign off, do you have any last things you want to add or say before we sign off here?
I only have to say goodbye, guys. I've enjoyed being here. Thank you all for being here too.
All right. So thank you all for joining us. We're right at that time. It's 11:29. So I'm going to go ahead and say thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for spending an hour with us. It's always great to see you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hope to see you soon in another town hall or another class. Remember, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, keep smiling, and we will get through this. All right. Take care, everybody.